Ambassador Ross just arrived, and I'm very glad to call him to the stage. I would like you, Ambassador Ross, since we are now in the stage of speaking about policy, not about intelligence or analysis, what are the implications for the US government, and what can the Obama administration do about the development of the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening, as we have decided is a better name. But since you are here, I cannot stop from asking you two more questions. One about the Iranian strategy of the administration, since you were the main designer of it. Do you see that the Iranian strategy of the Obama administration is working? And there are some development in the last couple of weeks. Last but not least, you are the veteran and the most experienced, let's say, professional who is doing the peace process for the last 2 decades. Shlomo Brom spoke about the frozen peace process, the fact that it is in the parking lot or maybe in the freezer. What should we do in the light of the Arab Awakening to take it out of the freezer, out of the parking lot, and move it forward?
Thank you. Okay, well, those are 3 interesting questions. And I assume you've been talking about these kinds of issues. I, of course, could come and talk about something entirely different, but I won't. All right, so the first question really is, what are the implications for the United States of the Arab Awakening, and what is it that we ought to do in light of it? Well, I think the first thing to recognize is we didn't create it. This was something that was created internally. It wasn't created by us. I know there were some who feel that the United States somehow pushed a magic button, and once we pushed that magic button, all these things somehow materialized. If it wasn't for the United States, 2 million people wouldn't have turned out in the streets in Cairo. You know, that may sound nice to some, but it doesn't fit the reality. This was homegrown. It was a reflection of profound frustrations. It was a reflection of a reality where people felt a humiliation, an ongoing humiliation. You could ask the question, well, how come it erupted now? Well, it erupted, I think, because suddenly you had a demographic bulge that produced a lot of younger people who increasingly saw they have very few prospects, no sense of a future. They could compare their own situation to other people's situation because of the internet, because of social media. They were no longer in a situation where the regimes had a monopoly on information. They were in a situation where they could compare their circumstances to others. And they could also communicate with others. And the result of that was to create a whole new dynamic. You know, it wasn't that Tunisia was something that others then said, well, we want to be exactly like the Tunisians, but what Tunisia did is set in motion what's known as contagion, meaning what you saw in Cairo was that people in Cairo looked at Tunisia and said, if they can do it, why can't we do it? So the first point here, before we think about what the United States does in light of it, is they created it. We didn't create it. The second point is it is a certainty that the Islamists were going to have all the built-in advantages up front. You're talking about a region that over the last 30 years was basically in a political coma, where the regimes denied any real space for political competition. And they certainly denied those who were secular, and I'll put in quotes, liberal, the ability to do anything politically because they saw them as a threat. What they couldn't do is shut down the mosque, because the mosque was a symbol of legitimacy and authenticity. And the mosque became the one vehicle where you could organize and you could speak. But those who organized and spoke in the mosque and organized themselves, they were not seen as corrupt. They were smart enough to think about how they could connect to all the segments, but certainly the lower classes in the society. They could do what the regime didn't do, which is actually provide social services. They didn't have the responsibility to provide the social services on a societal-wide basis. They could do it where they could. So they were seen as effective, they were seen as credible, they were seen as authentic. And the secular forces, first of all, had one big disadvantage, aside from the fact that they couldn't organize. The one big disadvantage is they were secular, and the regime was secular. And that created a certain stigma on them. So the Islamists have built-in advantages right now. All right, so given that reality, it's not a surprise that they're the ones who are doing well. The question is, what can we do about it? Having not created it, by definition, it means there's a certain humility that we have to have about how much we can do about it. We're certainly not in a position to go and dictate, because that'll produce a backlash against us. But we are in a position to do several things. This is not the same Middle East of a year ago. The fact of the matter is that those who are taking power now, if they took power a year ago, maybe they would try to rule just the way Ben Ali did or Mubarak did. But they can't rule, they have to govern. One thing has changed in the last year. In a place like Egypt, in a place like Tunisia, even a place like Yemen, people suddenly feel that they're citizens. They're not subjects. As citizens, they have a voice. Anybody who thinks they're suddenly going to decide, well, you know, we found our voice, and now we're going to give it up. No way is that going to happen. They're citizens, they have expectations, they have demands. The people who went and they voted for the Islamists, they voted for them because they're not corrupt. They voted for them because they're effective. I've read lots of interviews now with a lot of different people who were voting, including in places in parts of Cairo where, you know, very conservative, but when they were asked what they were voting for and they would explain, we're voting for the Muslim Brotherhood, they said, we're voting for the Muslim Brotherhood because they're going to provide jobs. Well, guess what? If the Muslim Brotherhood comes in now and decides, well, we don't have to provide jobs, we can go divert attention away, I think they're in for a rude awakening. Now, does that mean I think the Muslim Brotherhood or the Salafis are groups that don't really have an ideology? No, they have an ideology. They have a worldview. They have a philosophy. And I don't take that lightly. But they also have to operate in a different context. They have to deliver. They can't ignore the fact that they have, you know, in a sense now a public that sees themselves as having rights and able to make demands. And it's in our interest to think about what are the ways that we can create a kind of accountability. Now, we're not going to be able to do it, but we want accountability to be something that is part of the bloodstream. If people are seeing themselves as citizens and they have expectations, the one thing they're going to want to do is hold their government accountable. What we need to do is work with others to create a kind of constant repetition that there are certain manifestations of accountability. You want to be politically accountable, then you have to deliver, but you want to be politically accountable, it means you have to allow people to have a voice. It means you have to allow space for competition. It means you have to respect the rights of all, including minority rights. Economically, if you're going to deliver, you're going to need help from the outside. If you criminalize the private sector, you're not going to get help from the outside. You're certainly not getting an investment from the outside. You want to get help from the United States, you want to get help from others, well, if you don't live up to your international obligations, you're not going to get help. You know, if you abrogate the peace treaty with Israel, you're not going to get help. If you decide that you're going to go ahead and put the peace treaty to a referendum as a kind of clever way of saying, look, it's just the public who's spoken, you're not going to get help. You know, they're going to need help to deliver, and the role of the United States, I think, is not to put ourselves in a position where we can tell them what to do because they're not going to listen, but we can work with others to repeat what it takes for them to get help from the outside. If they didn't recognize the need for that help, they wouldn't be giving all sorts of interviews to all sorts of Western media and saying the kinds of things that they hope will be pleasing to our ears. So it isn't going to be what they say that matters, it's going to be what they do that matters. And we should be clear in terms of the context in which we're prepared to be responsive. We should be working with those internationally who have credibility in a place like Egypt. I've had conversations with a number of Egyptians, and one of the things I was struck by is that frequently they would say to me, what do you Americans know about transitions? When did you have your transition? It wasn't recently. But they'll say, who knows something about transitions? Well, the Poles know something about transition. The Hungarians know something about transition. Chile knows something about transition. Indonesia knows something about transition. We have to be working with others who are seen as being credible, creating, as I said, what are the standards of accountability? What are the basic red lines? And the more you do that, the more you're going to create a context in which, at least from the outside, there's some ability to, I think, affect the context on the inside. But the most important thing to keep in mind is, again, this is not the same Middle East of a year ago. The idea that somehow they can come in and they're going to coerce everybody into silence. Well, guess what? Look at Syria. Does coercion work there? This is not the same Middle East. Now, that doesn't mean this is something that we can now be relaxed about. We shouldn't have any illusions about who they are. That's the fact. That's the reality. But they do have to deliver. They can't simply ignore the reality. There's a great quote from Tom Friedman was in Cairo, and he did one column and he spoke to one of the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he was asking him, well, how are you actually going to come in and govern? And he was asking him specifically, all right, how are you going to apply your philosophy? And he said to Tom the following. He said, look, there may be 20,000 people in Egypt who drink alcohol. And there are 40 million who don't have access to clean water. You think we're going to come in and focus on the 20,000, or you think we're going to address the 40 million? All right, let's see what they do. Not what they say, let's see what they do. I said, for us, we have to be very clear about the do's and don'ts from our standpoint. The fact is, of course, they got elected, they're going to govern. They're not entitled to certain kind of assistance from us, but they can have that assistance provided they play by a set of ground rules. You have international obligations, you live up to those obligations. That one measure of that, as I said, it's not just that you don't abrogate the peace treaty with Israel. It's also you don't suddenly allow the Sinai to become a platform for terror. You don't allow Hamas in Gaza to move out of Gaza into the Sinai and into Israel and carry out terror attacks. Is this going to be a more complicated reality? Of course it's going to be a more complicated reality. But the fact is, the reaction to this is to think about what are the options we have to try to affect things to the extent we can, with, as I said, maintaining a degree of humility. Okay, so on Iran, is the strategy working? Well, strategies are obviously designed to address objectives, and you develop a set of means to try to affect the objective. The essence of strategy is obviously the right marriage of objectives and means. The objective is to change the Iranian behavior. On the nuclear issue, the objective is to prevent the Iranians from acquiring a nuclear weapons capability. Now, the means to affect that are pressure. Now, I want to get at the issue of sanctions because that's obviously the form of pressure that is the one that can be made to be felt most acute, but it's not the only form of pressure. When the Obama administration came into office, the situation was that the Iranians had already mastered the fuel cycle. At that point, they were able to basically enrich uranium on their own without anybody's help. They were also in a situation where, in the region, they were on a roll, or they were perceived as being on a roll. They seemed to have a great reach everywhere in the region. And the focal point of almost everybody in the area, certainly that we would talk to among the leading Arab states, was Iran is on a roll, Iran is feeling highly confident, Iran has great leverage, Iran is the problem. Internationally, there hadn't been any sanctions adopted in almost a year. Iran wasn't isolated internationally. It was on a roll in the region. It was self-confident internally, and it basically was already enriching uranium. Now that's the context in which we came in. Now what's the context today? The context today is Iran is more isolated than it's ever been. At least this Iranian government is more isolated than it's ever been. One measure of that, you get a vote in the the UN General Assembly of 106 to 9 against the Iranians, calling on the Iranians to provide protection for diplomatic personnel. Not a single Muslim majority country voted with the Iranians. That's a pretty interesting manifestation of them being isolated. In the region, they're not on a roll anymore. The one real, quote, ally that it had in the region, because Hezbollah I view as much an instrument as an ally, was Syria. You're talking about the balance of power in the region? Well, take a look at what's happening in Syria. This is a regime that I think is unlikely to survive. And so from a standpoint of what's happening in the balance of power, from an Iranian standpoint, they may have thought that the Arab awakening was going to be this big advantage for them, this big boon for them, because friends of the United States would be the ones who would suffer. Well, it turns out that their only real friend, or at least the one that they relied on the most, is the one that is probably in profound trouble. And if, in fact, you take a look at of the behavior of the Gulf states at this point, when the Europeans go ahead and announce that they're going to boycott the buying of Iranian oil, Saudi Arabia announces publicly they're prepared to fill in any gaps. And Iran actually says publicly that's an unfriendly act. But the Saudis go ahead and do it anyway. Not exactly the sign of someone who's looking at the Iranians and fearing that somehow they're on a roll. So internationally, they're isolated in a way they haven't been before. Regionally, the balance of power is actually shifting not in their favor, and this is one manifestation when the Saudis say that. And economically, even before the most recent adoption this week of the European announcement on boycotting the oil, they were already in trouble. I mean, even before the president signed into law the penalties on the central bank, which was the last day of 2011, Iran couldn't do business with any reputable bank internationally. Iran couldn't get insurance for its shipping. And if a ship had a lien on it, if it went to a foreign port, it was seized. Iran couldn't get lines of credit. Its own oil minister announced that they had a $100 billion gap in terms of what they needed with regard to investment in their energy infrastructure. This was even before the most recent round. Now what's happening is that you're dealing with the kinds of sanctions that actually begin to meet the standard of being crippling. It's not an accident you're seeing a profound fluctuation in the currency within Iran, which basically devalues everything, all the money that people hold. If you were looking at YouTubes in the last couple of weeks, you actually saw demonstrations in front of banks within Iran. The Iranians right now are feeling the pressure. It's not an accident that suddenly you saw the threats, we're going to close down the Straits of Hormuz. They were doing this because this is their response. When they're under pressure, they show we're going to be defiant, we're not going to give in. Except this isn't a threat they necessarily want to act on. So, when you have a senior member of the Revolutionary Guard declare they're going to close down the Straits of Hormuz, then you actually have the defense minister who comes out of the Revolutionary Guard who says, no, we're not going to close down the Strait of Hormuz. And then suddenly they say, after not responding to a letter in October from Cassie Ashton, representing the PERM 5+1, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, and the Germans. In October, there was an invitation to come back to talks, provided the Iranians were going to come and talk about their nuclear program. No response from the Iranians. Suddenly, there's a response from the Iranians. Yes, we're going to come back and we're going to talk with the 5+1. And they invite the IAEA to send a delegation to Iran to address the questions that the Iranians haven't been responding to. So as I set up my answer to your question, the context has changed dramatically. The means we have been employing are effective insofar as they are putting real pressure on the Iranians. Now, the assumption of the strategy was always you put pressure on the Iranians to the point where the Iranians recognize that the price they're paying is not a price they want to pay. It's too high as they measure the price, and so they look for a way out. If you look historically, when they've been under real pressure, they've sought ways out. You know, Khomeini, when he concluded the ceasefire with Iraq to end an 8.5-year war, described what he was having to do as he signed it as like drinking poison from a chalice. He didn't want to do it, but he did it. When the Iranians stopped assassinating dissidents in Europe, the Europeans had threatened to sanction them. And they decided the price was too high and they weren't going to do it. In 2003, when they suspended enrichment for a period of time, and actually apparently even proposed something interesting on the nuclear program, it's when we had defeated the Iraqi army in 3 weeks, an army that they, after 8.5 years, had to pursue a ceasefire with and drink from that poison chalice. So basically the essence of the strategy has been put the Iranians in a position where the pressure is real as they feel it, not as we think it should be, but as they feel it, and leave them a way out. That's what's being done. Now we're going to see if the strategy works. As I said, the end of the day, the measure is, do they change their behavior? I presume this may be part of the questions. There's a question of, is there going to be sufficient time for this to work? We will see. I heard the defense minister of Israel last week say that, you know, it was far off. His words, it was far off before Israel would contemplate would contemplate a strike. There's no doubt that from an Israeli standpoint, the desire all along has been not for this to be an Israeli-Iranian issue. This is the world against Iran. It's not Israel against Iran. And so if the strategy that the international community has now adopted is putting real pressure on Iran, we'll see if the Iranians seek a way out, and if, when you see a negotiation, which I believe we will see relatively soon, if that negotiation can succeed. Some people will say, oh, well, I'll just use negotiations to string things out. Okay, except that guess what? The pressure they're under doesn't stop. It keeps building. And it's a price, as we see, they don't want to pay. So we're going to see if this can work. I believe that basically the Obama administration has transformed the context, has mobilized the kind of pressure that most thought wasn't possible. You know, there aren't a lot of people I knew who predicted that at some point the European Union would agree to boycott the buying of Iranian oil. Well, they've now done so. All right. On to the question of the peace issue, because, as almost said, I'll put it in my words, I'm a grizzled veteran of this issue, proving only one thing: I've endured a long time. Unfortunately, the effort to try to make peace has also been something that's taken a very long time. Shlomo Braun referred to it as the frozen peace process. You know, look, right now, the good news is that there actually are preparatory talks. And that is, it's important, there are preparatory talks. It's also true that preparatory talks are not negotiations. I mean, both sides acknowledge these are not negotiations, these are preparatory talks for negotiations. But it is important, at least, that they're preparatory talks, because one of the troubling things has been you really haven't had the lines of communication that you've often seen in the past. And certainly there's no prospect of producing any kind of agreement if the two sides aren't even talking. So the preparatory talks are a sign that at least there's some sense of possibility, and that's important. I do have low expectations that there's going to be an early breakthrough on the talks, because I think there really is a kind of profound psychological gap right now, and when there's a profound psychological gap, it makes it difficult, the psychology makes it difficult to get at the substance that actually divides the parties. I do feel there's been an evolution over time that the actual gap on the substance is not nearly as profound as it once was. But I think it's hard to bridge those gaps at this point until you also bridge some of the psychological gaps. But you don't have the luxury, I don't believe there is the luxury of sitting back and doing nothing. Because I'm afraid if you sit back and do nothing, then what you guarantee is that the future is going to be defined by those who reject the very idea of peace. You know, we're looking right now at what I was describing before as the emergence of the Islamists around the region. Now, they're not exactly the embodiment of those who want to make peace. So if the future is going to be defined by those who don't want to make peace, if you sit back and do nothing, and there are some people who say, look, there's too much uncertainty, let's wait, let's let the dust settle. Well, I can tell you how the dust is going to settle. It's not going to settle in a good way. You know, when you think strategically, rarely sitting back and doing nothing is a good idea. There are those who say, don't do anything because, you know, wait and see. But when you sit back and you do nothing, the one thing you guarantee is that the options you have available almost always shrink. And the one thing I can say is, as someone who's done a lot of policy planning, you're trying to expand the scope of your options. You're not trying to shrink the options you have available. So when you face a situation where the prospects aren't good, that isn't the time to sit back and say, well, there's nothing to be done. And I would say one of the things that is to be done right now is to think about the prospect. Let's hope that the preparatory talks lead somewhere. But let's not say there's nothing to be done other than through that particular track. And there's a reason I say that. What's the one currency that has now developed a lot of credibility in the neighborhood? It's elections, right? Everyone wants to hold elections. Abu Mazen has said he wants to hold elections in May. Now, I'm not going to hold my breath and assume that elections are going to take place in May. But I do think the pressures on Abu Mazen and on Hamas and Fatah are going to increase precisely because elections are the currency. And as the pressures go up on them, at some point during the coming year, there will be elections among the Palestinians. Now, the one thing that's clear about Abu Mazen and Salam Fayyad is that they are committed to nonviolence. That's, you know, there can be all sorts of disagreements, but the one thing on which there's no disagreement is they are committed to nonviolence. They've proven it. It's not a rhetorical posture, it's a practical posture. They created, clearly with our help, professional security forces. I often say, if the kind of security forces that exist today among the Palestinians existed in the 1990s and weren't politicized the way they were in the 1990s, we might well have achieved a real breakthrough. Now, that commitment to nonviolence is not something to be dismissed. What it represents is there is a constituency, there is a segment of Palestinians who believe that nonviolence is the right way. They need to be validated. If there's going to be elections, you're going to have those who believe in violence. Hamas embodies a prescription for violence. You know, I know that the deal for Gilad Shalit was done for a different purpose. I understand why the deal was done for Gilad Shalit. I understand there is a basic compact, not only between the state, but also between the military and all the soldiers. I've talked to Gabi about this. I understand the nature of that. But even though the purpose wasn't to validate Hamas, that was the effect. Hamas commits violence, says violence works. So if you're going to have an election, and that election is going to shape the identity of Palestinians in the future, isn't it in Israel's interest that the Palestinians who get validated are those who believe in nonviolence? Now, I know there's always a great desire to ensure there's reciprocity, and I believe it. Yuval knows that I used to talk about something called coordinated unilateralism. I always have felt that when Israel is the only one to move, it's not a good thing to do because it relieves the Palestinians of responsibility. I want them to take steps too. So if Israel is going to take certain steps, the Palestinians should take steps also. But let's assume for the moment that maybe that's not going to happen. And yet you still know you're going to have elections coming this year. Israel has a strategic interest that the Palestinians who get validated are those who believe in nonviolence. That's in Israel's interest. And so the question at this point is, what can be done, even as you try to make the preparatory talks work, to validate those Palestinians who believe in nonviolence? Oftentimes, those who are engaged in the... I'm about to wrap up. I could go on and on and on, but I actually am about to wrap up. Although I'm getting to the punchline. Oftentimes those who are engaged in the state-building effort on the Palestinian side are accused of making occupation acceptable. What they need to be shown to be doing is demonstrating that the occupation is actually shrinking, that the occupation will recede. That's what will validate them. That's what allows them to say, our way works, not the other way, not the violence way. So that's why I wrote an article a couple of weeks ago in which I suggested that even though I might like to see reciprocity, I would still favor it. If Israel is going to take a series of steps, I would like to see the Palestinians take steps in parallel. But regardless, I believe it's in Israel's interest to validate those who believe in nonviolence and to show that their way works. So what you can do is, in Area A, one of the things you used to always say is they do more, we do less. And so you can create some criteria in Area A where even already the incursions have been reduced, but you can create criteria where, in fact, the incursions into Area A could either be stopped in some areas or you can come up with criteria for how they would be stopped altogether. Because the incursions, even if they're more limited, they still grate on Palestinians. In Area B, you can increase the presence of the Palestinian police. You can increase their presence, you can increase their infrastructure, you can increase the scope of their activity. In Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, 60%, Palestinians in Area C have very limited economic activity, very limited. You want to demonstrate that something's changing, that Palestinians would see and feel? In Area C, allow Palestinians to have dramatically more economic activity. Aside from the fact that it would have an economic benefit for them, it'll also demonstrate something, that the reality of Israeli control is changing and it's shrinking. There are other ideas. That's not an exhaustive list. The point is, there are steps that can be done that don't put Israeli security at risk, that don't even necessarily have to require changing the political status, which ought to be a function of negotiations, although it doesn't have to be. If you go back to the concept of further redeployments and the interim agreement, of which I hope to negotiate, it doesn't have to be that way. And, in a sense, can create a different kind of climate as well. If it's in Israel's strategic interest to do it, if the future of the Palestinian identity is going to be affected in the coming year, and think about this, is my last comment. Where we've seen the elections so far, the Islamists have been the ones who won. Wouldn't it be something, if you end up helping to validate those Palestinians who believe in nonviolence, wouldn't it be something if the first election in the Middle East that doesn't go the Islamist way is among the Palestinians? Think about the consequences of that in this context now. Thank you very much.